Alexander Hamilton, by Ron Chernow. Introduction. In the quiet, sunlit parlor of a house in Washington, D.C., in the middle of the 19th century, an old woman sits by the window. She is almost 100 years old, nearly blind, nearly deaf, but her hands are never still. She knits, she arranges flowers, and she waits. Most people who walk by have no idea who she is. They don't know that she is the last living link to the Founding Fathers, the final thread connecting their world to the one that is about to be torn apart by the Civil War. Her name is Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. And for 50 years, a full half-century, she has been on a holy quest to rescue the reputation of her husband. The man who was stolen from her one summer morning on a rocky ledge in Weehawken, New Jersey, by a dueling pistol fired by the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. When visitors come, she takes them on a tour of her memories. She points to a silver wine cooler, a gift from George Washington himself. And then she pauses before a marble bust in the corner, a sculpture of her husband, Alexander Hamilton, captured in his prime. She leans on her cane and just stares at his face, lost in a time that only she can remember. "Justice," she would say to her children, "shall be done to the memory of my Hamilton." So, has justice been done? Few figures in American history have been so loved and so loathed, so celebrated and so condemned. He was a brilliant visionary, the boy wonder of early American politics. But he was also called an elitist, a monarchist, a would-be Caesar who was the evil genius of this country. Today, we're diving into the book that brought this complicated, contradictory, and absolutely essential founder back to life for millions of people, Ron Chernow's monumental biography, Alexander Hamilton. This isn't just a book that became a New York Times bestseller, it's a book that inspired a cultural phenomenon, a Broadway musical that changed the way a generation sees American history. Chernow, a master biographer who has chronicled the lives of giants like Rockefeller and Morgan, spent a decade on this work, and it shows. He doesn't just tell you what Hamilton did, he takes you inside his mind, his heart, and his world. And what a world it was. By the end of our journey today, you will understand the almost unbelievable story of how an orphaned, penniless immigrant from a forgotten speck in the Caribbean came to America, and through sheer force of will, became the architect of its government, its financial system, and its future. This is more than a history lesson. It's a story about ambition, resilience, and the relentless drive to create a legacy against impossible odds. It's a story about what one person can achieve when they refuse to be defined by their circumstances. And it's a story that, I promise you, holds powerful lessons for your own life today. Book summary. The story of Alexander Hamilton does not begin in the halls of power or on the battlefields of the Revolution. It begins in a place that feels like the edge of the world, a tiny sun-scorched island in the Caribbean called Nevis. In the 1700s, this was no sleepy tourist spot. This was the brutal, lucrative heart of the sugar trade, a place of staggering wealth built on the backs of thousands of slaves. It was a tropical hellhole, as Ron Chernow calls it, filled with fortune hunters, criminals, and dissipated plantation owners. While other founders were raised in tidy New England towns or on grand Virginia estates, Hamilton was born into the chaos and squalor of this world. His origins were so clouded in scandal that he spent his entire life trying to escape them. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was a woman of stunning beauty and fierce independence, trapped in a loveless marriage to an older man, Johann Michael Levine. She was so rebellious that her husband, in a fit of rage, had her thrown into the town jail for adultery. After months in a cramped, filthy cell, she was released, but she was not broken. Instead of returning to him, she fled the island, abandoning her husband and her one legitimate son, Peter. It was an act of incredible defiance, and it's impossible not to see a preview of her son's own passionate, headstrong nature. On another island, she met James Hamilton, the fourth son of a Scottish laird. He had come to the West Indies dreaming of riches, but his ventures had failed. He was charming but indolent, a man with a storybook upbringing who now found himself adrift. Rachel and James were two scarred souls who found comfort in each other. They were never legally married. Rachel's vindictive ex-husband made sure of that, but they lived as a couple and had two sons, James Jr. and, on January 11, 1755, Alexander. Being born a bastard was a stigma that would follow Hamilton for the rest of his life. It fueled a relentless, almost painful ambition within him. He was a small, slight boy with reddish-brown hair and sparkling violet-blue eyes, but behind those eyes was a mind of ferocious intelligence. He had almost no formal schooling. He was taught, for a time, by a Jewish headmistress on Nevis, which gave him a lifelong reverence for the Jewish people. But mostly, he was self-taught, devouring every book he could get his hands on. He was a boy escaping into a world of words. And he needed to escape. His childhood was a cascade of disasters. When he was about 10, his father, James Hamilton, deserted the family. Alexander would never see him again. He wrote about his father with a sort of pitying forgiveness, calling him a man of pride but too much indolence. Alexander inherited the pride, but not the indolence. His own capacity for work would be a lifelong, unspoken commentary on his father's failings. Now the family's sole provider, his mother Rachel opened a small shop selling supplies to planters. But the tragedies kept coming. In 1768, a terrible fever swept through their home. Alexander and his mother lay side by side in the same bed, both delirious. He was just 13 years old, and he was likely inches away from his mother when she died. He was now an orphan. In the probate court that followed, his mother's ex-husband, Levine, reappeared like a ghost from the past. He branded Alexander and his brother as obscene children born in whoredom and made sure they were disinherited, leaving them utterly penniless. They were taken in by a cousin, Peter Lytton, but the horror wasn't over. A year later, Lytton committed suicide, leaving the two boys completely alone in the world. His brother, James, was apprenticed to a carpenter and faded into obscurity. But something in Alexander, his fierce intelligence, his unshakable self-reliance, was spotted by local merchants. He was given a job as a clerk in the trading firm of Beekman and Kruger. This was no dusty back-office job. It was a crash course in global commerce. Hamilton learned about currencies, shipping routes, credit, and debt. He dealt in everything from lumber to mules to, tragically, slaves. The cruelty of the slave trade on the island left him with a permanent hatred of the institution, and he would later become one of the most outspoken abolitionists among the Founding Fathers. But clerking was not enough for him. His mind was too big, his ambition too vast. In his earliest surviving letter, written to his friend Edward Stevens, the 14-year-old Hamilton confessed his deepest desires. To confess my weakness, Ned, my ambition is so prevalent that I contemn the groveling condition of a clerk, and would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station. And then, he added a line that seems almost chillingly prophetic: I wish there was a war. He would get his war, but first, he needed a miracle. And that miracle came in the form of a disaster. In August of 1772, a monstrous hurricane tore through Street. Qua. It was a storm of biblical fury, ripping trees from the ground and splintering houses. Hamilton witnessed the horror firsthand and poured all of his emotion and intellect into a long, feverish letter to his father. He described the fiery meteors flying about, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed. It was a brilliant piece of writing, filled with passion and theological reflection. He showed it to his mentor, the Reverend Hugh Knox, who was so impressed that he had it published in the local newspaper. The letter caused a sensation. Who was this brilliant, self-taught young man? The island's business leaders were so moved that they took up a collection, a subscription fund, to send this promising youth to North America for an education. Alexander Hamilton had, quite literally, written his way out of poverty. He boarded a ship for Boston, leaving the West Indies behind forever. He never looked back. He took his scarred past, tucked it away in a mental closet, and never opened the door again. He was determined to reinvent himself, to forge a new identity where he would be judged for what he did, not for where he came from. He arrived in New York in 1772, a young man from the tropics who had probably never seen a change of seasons. But he was no provincial bumpkin. Smart, handsome, and fiercely ambitious, he quickly found his footing. He enrolled in a preparatory school in New Jersey, where he studied with a ferocious intensity, often working past midnight and waking at dawn to pace the local graveyard, memorizing his lessons. He was aiming for college, and he set his sights on Princeton. He made an audacious proposal to its president, John Witherspoon. He wanted to advance at his own pace, as quickly as his abilities would allow. The college refused. It was a rejection that would change the course of his life and American history. Spurned by Princeton, Hamilton ended up at King's College in New York City, which would later become Columbia University. This placed him in the heart of the colony's most vibrant commercial city, and at the epicenter of the growing revolutionary ferment. King's College was just a block away from the grassy common where radicals gathered under a towering liberty pole. It was in this very park, in July 1774, that the 19-year-old Hamilton made his debut as a rabble-rousing orator. After news of British crackdowns in Boston, a mass meeting was called. Hamilton, still a student, supposedly jumped onto the platform and, after a hesitant start, delivered a fiery speech defending the Boston Tea Party and calling for a boycott of British goods. The crowd was stunned. "It is a collegian," they whispered. "It is a collegian." From that moment on, he was a young hero of the cause. But Hamilton was never a simple revolutionary. He had a deep-seated fear of mob rule, a dread of anarchy that was forged in the lawless world of the Caribbean. This contradiction came to life one night in May 1775, when an angry mob descended on King's College, intending to tar and feather its Tory president, Miles Cooper. Hamilton, his student, stood on the steps of the building and harangued the crowd, not to incite them, but to pacify them. He spoke of the glorious cause of liberty and warned that their actions would disgrace it. He bought just enough time for President Cooper to scramble out a back window and escape. The incident was a perfect snapshot of the man Hamilton would become, a committed revolutionary who was also a profound believer in law and order. As the colonies hurtled toward war, Hamilton's verbal talents became his greatest weapon. He entered into a pamphlet war with a prominent Tory writer, Samuel Seabury, who wrote under the name A. Westchester Farmer. Hamilton, still a teenager, responded with two brilliant, lengthy essays, a full vindication of the measures of the Congress and the Farmer refuted. In these essays, he laid out the colonists' case with a lawyerly precision and astonishing command of history, philosophy, and economics. He defended the Continental Congress, argued for natural rights, and, most incredibly, even sketched out the military strategy that would eventually win the war, not pitched battles, but a war of attrition, harassing the British Army with frequent skirmishes. It was a stunningly precocious performance. Many people refused to believe that so young a man could have written them, attributing the works to older, more established figures like John Jay. But Hamilton's ambition was not just literary. He still dreamed of martial glory. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, he joined a volunteer militia company in New York called the Hearts of Oak. They drilled each morning before classes in a churchyard, wearing green jackets and leather caps with the motto "Liberty or Death." Hamilton was not just playing soldier. He devoured books on military tactics and became an expert in artillery. In 1776, he got his chance. The New York Provincial Congress created an artillery company, and Hamilton, now just 21, was named its captain. He was a tough but fair-minded leader, known for sharing hardships with his men. His company quickly became a model of discipline, and it wasn't long before his talents were noticed by senior officers, including a general named Nathaniel Greene. But the person who would change his life was, of course, George Washington. After a series of devastating losses in New York, Washington's battered Continental Army retreated across New Jersey in late 1776. It was a desperate time, the army on the verge of collapse. During this grim retreat, Washington had a chance to see Captain Hamilton in action. At the Raritan River, Hamilton's artillery company provided crucial cover for the retreating Patriots, holding off the advancing British columns with a smart cannonade. Washington was charmed by the young captain's brilliant courage and skill. A few weeks later, on Christmas night, Hamilton was with Washington during the legendary crossing of the Delaware River. He and his men hauled their cannons through the snow and sleet for the surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton. It was a stunning victory that saved the Revolution, and Hamilton's artillery played a key role. A week later, at the Battle of Princeton, he was there again, firing his cannons into a building where British soldiers had taken refuge. Washington had seen enough. In January 1777, he personally invited Hamilton to join his staff as an aide-de-camp. It was an incredible honor, a promotion to lieutenant colonel, and an entry into the inner circle of the most eminent man in America. In less than 5 years, the clerk from St. Croix was now at the right hand of the commander-in-chief. For Hamilton, however, the job was a mixed blessing. He craved battlefield glory, and he now found himself chained to a desk, handling Washington's colossal mountain of paperwork. The taciturn Washington needed a fluent writer, someone who could not just take dictation, but think for me, as he put it. Hamilton was perfect. He had an almost spooky ability to intuit what Washington wanted to say and draft it with tact and elegance. He became Washington's indispensable scribe, his chief of staff, his trusted envoy. The job gave him an unparalleled, wide-angle view of the war. He dealt with Congress, state governors, and powerful generals. He interrogated deserters and negotiated prisoner exchanges. He saw firsthand the crippling weakness of the central government under the Articles of Confederation, and the selfish squabbling of the states. He and Washington both came to believe deeply in the need for a strong national government, a conviction that would shape the rest of their lives. At headquarters, Hamilton was part of Washington's military family. He was the youngest of the aides, but he quickly became the most important. The other aides nicknamed him the Little Lion. It was here that he formed some of the most important friendships of his life. There was the Marquis de Lafayette, the dashing young French aristocrat who became like a son to Washington. And there was John Lawrence, a brilliant, idealistic officer from South Carolina. Lawrence shared Hamilton's hatred of slavery, and the two became inseparable, spiritual twins who dreamed of military honor. The letters between them are filled with such unbridled affection that some historians have wondered if their bond went beyond friendship. At the very least, Hamilton had found his peer, his soulmate in the cause. But the central relationship of his life, and his career, was with Washington. It was a complex bond, built on mutual respect more than warm affection. Hamilton admired Washington's judgment and character, but he was one of the few people in Washington's circle who was not in awe of him. It was hard for Hamilton to subordinate himself to anyone, even Washington. There was always a suppressed rivalry between them. But he never doubted that Washington was the one indispensable man of the Revolution. He would serve him and defend him for the rest of his career. And then there was love. In the winter of 1780, while the army was quartered in Morristown, New Jersey, a young woman arrived to visit her relatives. Her name was Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of General Philip Schuyler, one of the most powerful and wealthy men in New York. Eliza, as she was called, was not a dazzling beauty, but she had dark, lively eyes, a warm smile, and a quiet strength. Hamilton was instantly smitten. One of his fellow aides wrote, "Hamilton is a gone man." He spent every evening courting her, and within a little more than a month, they were engaged. For the orphaned Hamilton, marrying into the Schuyler family was like annexing an entire clan. He was embraced by a world of wealth, power, and social standing that would have been unimaginable just a few years before. And in Eliza, he found the perfect companion, loyal, compassionate, and deeply devoted. He was also captivated by Eliza's older sister, Angelica Church. Witty, sophisticated, and flirtatious, Angelica was more Hamilton's intellectual counterpart. The attraction between them was so potent that many people assumed they were lovers. Their relationship was a complex triangle of affection, with Eliza seemingly untroubled by their intense bond. The two sisters, Angelica and Eliza, seemed to represent the two sides of Hamilton's nature, the worldly and the domestic. But Hamilton's focus was never far from the war. And as it dragged on, he grew increasingly frustrated with his desk job. He still yearned for a field command, for one last chance at the glory he had dreamed of since he was a boy. That chance came in the fall of 1781, at the siege of Yorktown. It was the decisive moment of the war. The American and French armies had trapped the British army under Lord Cornwallis on a narrow peninsula. To complete the trap, they needed to capture two key British fortifications, called redoubts. The attack was to be a dangerous bayonet charge at night. Lafayette was given command of the American forces, and he initially chose another officer to lead the charge. Hamilton was furious. He felt he had earned the right. He went directly to Washington and argued his case with all his fire and eloquence. Washington relented. Hamilton would get his command. On the night of October 14th, Hamilton and his men waited in the trenches. Under a sky lit up by exploding shells, they were given the signal. They raced across the open ground, their bayonets fixed, letting out fierce war whoops. They had unloaded their guns, determined to take the position with cold steel alone. Hamilton was the first to reach the enemy parapet. He leaped up, calling for his men to follow, and they swarmed into the redoubt. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes. It was a stunning success, and a moment of pure, unadulterated glory for Hamilton. He was exemplary in victory, preventing his men from harming any of the surrendering British soldiers. The capture of the redoubts was the final nail in the coffin for Cornwallis. A few days later, he surrendered his entire army. The war was effectively over. Hamilton had finally gotten the military fame he so desperately craved. It was a credential that would be invaluable in the political world to come. He was no longer just Washington's brilliant aide, he was a war hero in his own right. The Revolution had transformed him. It had given the outsider a country, a family, and a future. After Yorktown, Hamilton resigned his commission and, for a time, became a family man. Eliza gave birth to their first son, Philip. Hamilton, with his typical speed, crammed 3 years of legal study into 9 months and was admitted to the New York bar. He quickly established himself as one of the city's premier lawyers, but his mind was never far from public affairs. He saw that the country he had fought for was in danger. Under the weak Articles of Confederation, the states were squabbling, the government was bankrupt, and the nation was a laughingstock in Europe. The frail and worthless fabric, he called it. He began to write a series of essays, The Continentalist, calling for a stronger central government. And he was not alone. He found a powerful ally in another brilliant young politician, James Madison of Virginia. They were a new generation of leaders, men whose careers were defined not by loyalty to a state, but to the idea of an American nation. Their efforts, along with those of Washington, led to a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, a meeting called merely to revise the Articles of Confederation. But Hamilton and Madison had something far more audacious in mind. They wanted to create a brand new government. Hamilton's role at the Constitutional Convention was complicated. He was a minority delegate from a state, New York, that was hostile to a strong federal government. Frustrated by the endless debates and compromises, he delivered a marathon 6-hour speech on June 18 that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In it, he laid out his own plan for a new government. He called for a president and senate who would serve for life, on good behavior. It wasn't a monarchy, as his enemies later claimed. They would be elected, but it was far too close for comfort for most of his colleagues. He praised the British government as the best in the world. The speech was brilliant, courageous, and completely out of touch with the political reality of America. It was a spectacular miscalculation. No one supported his plan, and it cemented his reputation in the minds of his critics as a dangerous monarchist. In the end, Hamilton did what he always did when faced with a choice between an imperfect reality and his own ideal vision. He embraced reality. He became a staunch supporter of the final Constitution, even though it fell far short of what he wanted. He was the only delegate from New York to sign it. Is it possible to deliberate between anarchy and convulsion on one side, he asked, and the chance of good to be expected from the plan on the other? The fight was now on to get the Constitution ratified. And in New York, the opposition was fierce, led by Governor George Clinton. The battle would be won or lost not with swords, but with words. And this was the moment that gave birth to Hamilton's greatest literary achievement. He conceived of a series of essays, a comprehensive defense of the new Constitution, to be published in the New York newspapers. He recruited John Jay and James Madison to join him. They wrote under the shared pseudonym Publius. The result was the Federalist Papers. It was a project of astonishing speed and scale. In 7 months, Hamilton and Madison, with a small contribution from an ailing Jay, churned out 85 essays. Hamilton wrote 51 of them. They were composed under intense deadline pressure, often with the printer's boy waiting at the door for the next installment. The Federalist is the most important work of political theory ever written in America. It was a brilliant, detailed, and persuasive explanation of the Constitution, a masterclass in the mechanics of government. And it was instrumental in winning the battle for ratification, especially in the crucial states of Virginia and New York. At the New York ratifying convention in Poughkeepsie, Hamilton was the undisputed star. Though outnumbered by anti-federalists more than 2-1, he spoke for 6 grueling weeks, debating every clause of the Constitution, wearing down the opposition with his relentless logic and impassioned eloquence. In the end, he won. By a razor-thin margin of 30-27, New York ratified the Constitution. The new government was a reality. A huge parade was held in New York City to celebrate. And at its center was a miniature frigate, gliding down Broadway, named the Federal ship Hamilton. The boy from Nevis was, for a moment, the hero of his adopted city. The new nation needed a president, and there was only one choice: George Washington. And Washington needed a Treasury secretary who could rescue the country from bankruptcy. Again, there was only one choice: Alexander Hamilton. His friends warned him against taking the job. It would be a thankless task, exposing him to endless criticism. His legal practice was far more lucrative. But Hamilton saw it as his duty, and his destiny. I conceived myself to be under an obligation to lend my aid towards putting the machine in some regular motion, he said. At 34, He was now the second most powerful man in America. The Treasury Department became his personal empire, dwarfing the other departments. He was an administrative genius, creating from scratch the systems for collecting taxes, managing the debt, and overseeing the customs service. But his vision went far beyond bookkeeping. In a series of monumental reports to Congress, he laid out a breathtaking plan to transform America into a modern economic powerhouse. First came the report on public credit. The nation was drowning in debt from the Revolution. Hamilton's solution was bold and controversial. He proposed that the federal government assume all the debts of the states, consolidating them into a single national debt. This would not only simplify the problem, it would create a powerful bond between the states and the new federal government. The creditors, the wealthy and powerful men of the country, would now have a vested interest in the success of the national government, not just their home states. He also insisted that the debt be paid in full, with no discrimination between the original holders of the bonds, many of them soldiers, and the speculators who had bought them for pennies on the dollar. This was a hugely unpopular decision, but Hamilton knew that for America to have a future, it had to establish the sanctity of contracts and the principle that the government honors its debts. Credit, he wrote, is an entire thing. Every part of it has the nicest sympathy with every other part. Wound one limb and the whole tree shrinks and decays. His plan was a stroke of genius, but it ignited a firestorm of opposition. And at the head of that opposition was his former collaborator, James Madison, now a congressman from Virginia. Madison argued that Hamilton's plan punished states like Virginia, which had already paid off much of their debt. He saw it as a scheme to enrich northern speculators at the expense of southern farmers. The friendship between Hamilton and Madison was shattered. And in this bitter debate, the first political parties in America were born. Those who supported Hamilton's vision of a strong, centralized, commercial nation became the Federalists. Those who followed Madison, and his powerful new ally, Thomas Jefferson, became the Republicans. And what an ally Jefferson was! He arrived in New York in 1790 to become Secretary of State, fresh from 5 years as the American minister in Paris. He was tall, elegant, and radiates an aura of philosophical calm. He had an almost mystical faith in the virtue of the common man, and a deep-seated fear of strong central government. He dreamed of an America of small, independent farmers, an agrarian paradise free from the corruptions of cities, banks, and factories. He and Hamilton were polar opposites, and they were now trapped together in Washington's small cabinet. Jefferson later recalled that they were daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. The clash came to a head over Hamilton's next great proposal, a national bank. The Bank of the United States would be a private institution, but it would serve public purposes. It would be a depository for government funds, issue paper money, and provide credit to both the government and private business. It was the linchpin of his financial system, the engine that would drive the new economy. Jefferson and Madison were horrified. They saw the bank as unconstitutional, a dangerous expansion of federal power. They argued that the Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress the power to create a bank. This was the moment Hamilton made his most enduring contribution to American constitutional law. In a brilliant 15,000-word opinion for Washington, he laid out the doctrine of implied powers. He argued that the government had the right to use any means necessary and proper to carry out its designated functions. If the government had the power to collect taxes and regulate commerce, it had the implied power to create a bank to help it do so. It was a broad, flexible interpretation of the Constitution that would allow the federal government to adapt and grow for centuries to come. Washington was convinced. He signed the bank bill into law. Hamilton had won again. The fight over assumption and the bank had been so bitter that it threatened to tear the new government apart. The deadlock was broken by one of the most famous deals in American history. As Jefferson told the story, he met a haggard, desperate Hamilton on the street one day. He invited him to dinner the next night, along with Madison. Over wine and food, they struck a bargain. Madison would allow the assumption of state debts to pass. In return, Hamilton would use his influence to ensure that the permanent capital of the United States would be located on the Potomac River, a victory for the South. It was a classic political compromise, but Jefferson would later claim that he had been duped by Hamilton. In truth, he had been outsmarted. Hamilton had gotten the cornerstone of his financial system, while Jefferson got a swampy piece of real estate. Hamilton's final great report, the Report on Manufactures, laid out his vision for America's industrial future. At a time when 95% of Americans were farmers, he called for government support for manufacturing, for tariffs to protect infant industries, and for the creation of a diversified economy. It was a breathtakingly modern vision, a prophecy of the America that was to come. But it was too much, too soon. The report was shelved by Congress. For a time, Hamilton's system seemed to work like magic. The country was prosperous, its credit was restored, and a wave of speculation, scripomania, they called it, swept the nation. But this also exposed the dark side of capitalism. Hamilton's old friend from King's College, William Duer, a reckless speculator, triggered the first financial panic in American history in 1792. Hamilton acted with the decisiveness of a modern central banker, using Treasury funds to buy government securities and stabilize the market. But the incident gave his enemies a powerful weapon. They could now point to the gambling and corruption that his system had supposedly unleashed. The feud with Jefferson and Madison intensified. They saw Hamilton as a monarchist, an Anglo-man, who was betraying the ideals of the Revolution. They secretly sponsored a partisan newspaper, the National Gazette, edited by Philip Freneau, to attack Hamilton and his policies. Hamilton, never one to suffer in silence, fought back with his own anonymous newspaper essays. The political atmosphere grew toxic. Washington pleaded for harmony, but it was too late. The two parties, Federalists and Republicans, were now a reality. In 1795, after 5.5 years in office, Hamilton resigned as Treasury Secretary. He was exhausted, in debt, and worn down by the constant attacks. But he was far from finished with politics. From his law office in New York, he remained the intellectual leader of the Federalist Party, a shadow president who continued to advise Washington and his cabinet. But without the restraining hand of Washington, Hamilton's judgment grew more erratic, his behavior more extreme. This became dangerously clear during the presidency of John Adams. Hamilton and Adams were two brilliant, vain, and stubborn men who were destined to clash. Adams resented Hamilton's influence, and Hamilton viewed Adams as unstable and unfit for the presidency. Their feud culminated in 1800, when Hamilton published a 54-page pamphlet attacking the sitting president of his own party. It was an act of political suicide, a spectacular display of self-destructive passion. It split the Federalist Party and virtually guaranteed that Thomas Jefferson would be the next president. And it was in this moment of defeat and despair that Hamilton made a fateful decision. The election of 1800 had resulted in a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. The contest was thrown into the House of Representatives, which was still controlled by the Federalists. Many Federalists, hating Jefferson, saw Burr as the lesser of two evils. Hamilton was horrified. He had clashed with Jefferson for a decade, but he saw him as a man of principle, however misguided. Burr, he believed, was a man of no principles at all, a Catiline of America, a dangerous opportunist who would destroy the country for his own gain. In a series of passionate letters, Hamilton urged his fellow Federalists to support Jefferson. It was the most improbable alliance in American history. And it worked. On the 36th ballot, Jefferson was elected president. Hamilton had saved the country from a Burr presidency, but he had made a mortal enemy. And then, there was the affair. In the summer of 1791, while Eliza and the children were away, a young woman named Maria Reynolds came to Hamilton's door. She told him a sob story of an abusive, abandoning husband. Hamilton, ever the chivalrous protector of women in distress, gave her money and walked her home. He was led to her bedroom. And so began a sordid affair that would last for a year. It was not long before Maria's husband, James Reynolds, reappeared. He was no angry, cuckolded husband. He was a small-time criminal, and he saw an opportunity. He began to blackmail the Treasury Secretary. For months, Hamilton paid him hush money, trapped by his own folly and his terror of the scandal being revealed to Eliza. The affair finally ended, but the secret did not hold. A few years later, James Reynolds was arrested for his part in a speculation scheme. To save himself, he implicated Hamilton, not in adultery, but in financial corruption. 3 Republican congressmen, including James Monroe, went to Hamilton to confront him. To prove his innocence of official misconduct, Hamilton had no choice but to confess his adultery. He showed them the blackmail letters from James and Maria Reynolds. The congressmen were satisfied and promised to keep the matter confidential. But in the venomous political world of the 1790s, no secret was safe. In 1797, a muckraking journalist named James Callender published the entire story, including the letters. He accused Hamilton not only of adultery, but of having invented the story to cover up his financial crimes. Hamilton was now faced with an impossible choice. He could remain silent and let the charge of public corruption stand, or he could confess to his private sin to save his public honor. He chose to confess. He published what became known as the Reynolds pamphlet, a 95-page document in which he told the entire humiliating story of his affair. It was the most shocking confession ever made by an American public figure. His friends were aghast. His enemies rejoiced. The pamphlet was a curious specimen of the ingenious folly of its author, said Madison. But for Hamilton, his public reputation was everything. He was willing to be seen as a sinner, but not as a corrupt official. The scandal was a terrible blow, but it was not the worst he would suffer. In 1801, his eldest son, Philip, a brilliant, handsome 19-year-old, was killed in a duel, defending his father's honor after a political speech. Hamilton was shattered. "Never did I see a man so completely overwhelmed with grief," wrote his friend Robert Troup. His beloved daughter, Angelica, was so traumatized by her brother's death that she suffered a mental breakdown from which she never recovered. A new darkness seemed to settle over Hamilton. He grew more religious, more withdrawn, and more fatalistic. He had built his country, and now he seemed to be watching it slip away into the hands of his enemies. But there was one final act to play. After being cast aside by Jefferson, Aaron Burr ran for governor of New York in 1804. He hoped to build a new political coalition of disgruntled Federalists and Republicans. Hamilton was appalled. He saw this as Burr's last, desperate grasp for power, and he believed it would be disastrous for the country. He worked tirelessly to defeat him. During the campaign, a letter was published in an Albany newspaper, written by a doctor, Charles Cooper. It mentioned a dinner party where Hamilton had spoken of Burr. Cooper wrote that he could detail a still more despicable opinion that Hamilton had expressed of Burr. This was the pretext Burr had been waiting for. For years, he had endured Hamilton's insults, his private and public condemnations. Now, his political career in ruins, his honor questioned, he saw a chance for vindication. On June 18, 1804, Burr sent a letter to Hamilton, demanding an explanation for the word despicable. It was the opening move in the rigid, formal ritual of an affair of honor. Hamilton was trapped. He knew that dueling was a barbaric practice, one that had already cost him his son. But in the world he lived in, to refuse a duel was to be branded a coward, to lose one's honor, and to sacrifice any future capacity for leadership. He believed the country might still need him, in a time of crisis, and he could not afford to seem weak. The correspondence between them over the next few weeks was a tangle of pride and legalistic quibbling. Neither man would back down. Hamilton made a fateful decision. He would accept the duel, but he would throw away his shot. He would fire into the air, giving Burr a chance to pause, to reflect, and to end the confrontation honorably. It was a gallant, and perhaps foolish, gamble. On the morning of July 11, 1804, the two men met on the rocky ledge at Weehawken. They stood 10 paces apart, the Hudson River glittering below them. They took their positions. The signal was given. 2 shots rang out. Hamilton rose up on his toes, twisted, and fell. Burr's shot had struck him in the abdomen, tearing through his liver and lodging in his spine. "This is a mortal wound, doctor," he said as his physician rushed to his side. He was carried back across the river to a friend's house in Greenwich Village. For 31 hours, he lay in agony, surrounded by his weeping family. He died the next afternoon. The city of New York, and the nation, was plunged into mourning. The grief was immense, mixed with shock and outrage at the senselessness of his death. Aaron Burr's political career was over. He had won the duel, but he had lost everything else. He became a name of horror, a pariah who would spend the rest of his life as an outcast. But the final chapter of this story belongs to Eliza. She outlived her husband by 50 years. She was left with 7 children, staggering debts, and a legacy to defend. She never remarried. She dedicated her life to 2 causes: helping orphans, a quiet tribute to the husband she had loved, and preserving his memory. She tirelessly collected his papers, interviewed his old comrades, and supervised the writing of his biography. She ensured that justice would, finally, be done to her Hamilton. She died in 1854, at the age of 97, and was buried beside him in the Trinity Churchyard in downtown Manhattan, not far from where the engine of American capitalism that he had created roared all around them. It was an improbable life, a story of such drama and achievement that, as one contemporary said, only an audacious novelist could have dreamed it up. He was a man of towering genius and fatal flaws, a builder of institutions and a breaker of rules. He was the immigrant who made America his own, the outsider who became the ultimate insider, the flawed hero who gave his life to the country he had helped to create. Commentary. So, what do we take away from this whirlwind of a life? It's easy to get lost in the drama, the duels, the scandals, the political battles. But if we step back, what Ron Chernow's biography reveals is a man whose ideas were so powerful, so fundamental, that they continue to shape the world we live in today. Think about it. We often talk about the Jeffersonian vision of America, the land of independent farmers, of small government, of rural virtue. It's a beautiful, poetic ideal. But it's not the America we inhabit. We live in Hamilton's America. We live in a world of bustling cities, of global trade, of dynamic financial markets. We have a strong central government with a professional military, an independent judiciary, and a powerful executive branch. All of this was part of Hamilton's vision. He was the messenger from a future that he, almost alone among his peers, could clearly see. While Jefferson feared that a strong government would crush liberty, Hamilton understood that a weak government could be just as dangerous. He had seen it firsthand during the Revolution, the chaos, the starvation, the disunity under the Articles of Confederation. He knew that liberty requires order. It requires a government strong enough to protect property, enforce contracts, and defend the nation. He also had a profound insight into human nature. He didn't believe people were angels. He knew we are driven by self-interest, by ambition, by a love of fame, but he didn't see this as a flaw to be stamped out. He saw it as a force to be harnessed. His economic system was designed to align the interests of the wealthy and ambitious with the interests of the nation. He wanted to turn their avarice and enterprise, as he called it, into a source of public prosperity. This is a deep and often misunderstood lesson. It's not about being cynical. It's about being realistic. It's about creating systems that work with human nature, not against it. But Chernow's book is about more than just politics and economics. It's a profoundly human story. It's the story of a man who was haunted by his past but never defeated by it. His illegitimacy, his poverty, his tragic childhood, these were the wounds that fueled his relentless drive. He was always the outsider, always trying to prove himself, always guarding his honor with a fierce, almost desperate intensity. And that, perhaps, is his most personal and powerful lesson for us. Your beginnings do not have to define your destiny. Hamilton's life is the ultimate testament to the power of resilience, of self-invention, of what you can achieve through sheer, unstoppable work. He literally worked himself to the top. Of course, that same ambition, that same passionate intensity, was also the source of his greatest flaws. He was impulsive, headstrong, and often blind to the effect he had on others. He was too honest for his own good, incapable of the subtle political maneuvering that came so easily to Jefferson or Burr. He made enemies as easily as he made friends. And in the end, his obsession with honor led him to that fatal ledge in Weehawken. So, as we close this chapter, what can we do, right now, to bring a piece of Hamilton's spirit into our own lives? First, think about the systems in your life. We all have goals: to get in shape, to learn a skill, to build a career. But Hamilton teaches us that goals are not enough. You need systems. You need a structure, a routine, a set of principles that make success not just possible, but probable. What is one system you can build today that will carry you toward your goals almost automatically? Second, embrace your ambition, but harness it. Hamilton was driven by a desire for fame, but he defined it as the ruling passion of the noblest minds, a passion that drives one to serve the public good. What is your noble ambition? What great work do you want to do that is bigger than yourself? And finally, consider your own legacy. Hamilton was intensely aware that he was building something that would outlast him. He was a founder, in every sense of the word. You don't have to build a nation to think about your legacy. What are you creating? In your family? In your community? In your work? That will endure? What story will people tell about you when you're gone? That was a summary of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary can only give you a glimpse of the real thing. The true power of this book is in the details, in living with Hamilton day by day, in feeling the weight of the decisions he had to make. This summary is meant to give you a taste, to help you decide if this epic journey is one you want to take for yourself. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about experiencing the birth of a nation through the eyes of one of its most brilliant and complex architects. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, I'd be so grateful if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that these stories matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.